Today we will learn and reflect on Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, which is a story of a young man who refused to listen to Socrates, and this is compared to a similar recent story of a family who was divided by actions taken in the recent Capitol riots. You may ask, how can we benefit when we ponder the Platonic dialogue of Euthyphro? This dialogue discusses a young man with strong convictions that's convinced that he is absolutely morally in the right with what he plans to do, but what he plans to do will greatly harm his father and his family's reputation, and he refuses to listen to the cautions offered by Socrates. This play is, in essence, a warning to us that we should carefully consider the difficult decisions that all of us face during our lives. We always like to quote from the works we're discussing. At the end of our talk, we will discuss the sources used for this video and my blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments, in the description. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn and reflect together. Socrates, in his trial, has been charged by the citizens of Athens of impiety and of corrupting the youth, and in preparation he must meet with the court officials in downtown Athens. There, at the court, he meets his friend Euthyphro, and they converse both about the serious charges filed against Socrates and the serious charge of murder Euthyphro intends to file in court against, surprisingly, his very own father. His father's slave had murdered another slave, so the father had bound up this murderous slave and thrown him in a ditch while he searched for a diviner with whom to consult on how he should punish this slave. And after a day or two in a ditch, this slave died. Socrates senses that his friend has little idea of the consequences of his action, and in his youthful haste he may make a decision that would lead to a miserable and penurious future, and that his friend has pondered little of this drastic action. Meanwhile, the friends and students of Socrates were upset that he spent so much time conversing with Euthyphro when he should have been working on his speech for the jury. But Socrates simply said that this dialogue with Euthyphro was preparation for his trial, as was all his philosophical arguments up to that moment. The dilemma all of us face in life when our child or relative or friend is going seriously astray is, how do you tell them? How do you get through to them? Simply shouting, "Stop, you fool!" usually doesn't work. So you wish you could get them to stop and think through what they're planning to do a little bit more carefully. A very similar story happened to a family that was torn apart because the dad participated in the insurrection during the Capitol riots on January 6th, where there are many ugly words and threats. After the riot, the FBI printed pictures of many ordinary citizens they wanted to arrest because they participated in the mayhem that caused the death of both police and at least one protester. Most of these insurrectionists had no prior criminal record, although a few did. Quoting from People magazine, but I'm leaving out the last names, like much of America, young Jackson watched the January 6th U.S. Capitol riot unfold on TV in horror. But he was more horrified than most people. I think it was Fox playing. They were live screening the riots at the Capitol and rushing in. My mom said, "Your dad is there." As federal authorities later began to comb through videos and online postings to identify those who breached the building, Jackson reported his father's presence at the event to the FBI and shared an earlier statement made by his father, warning him, "If you turn me in, son, you're a traitor, and you know what happened to traitors. Traitors get shot." And Jackson said, "If you were to write down that quote and give it to anyone, ever, it would never be okay." He said to the reporter, "My father said, choose a side or die." Returning to Euthyphro, Socrates decides he must try to persuade Euthyphro. He proceeds his efforts with patience, with kindness, avoiding criticism, avoiding lecturing. He compliments when he can. When reading the Platonic dialogues, we must avoid jumping to obvious conclusions. Sometimes there's no right answer. Perhaps Euthyphro was right in his decision. We will discuss this possibility at the end of our discussion. So, Socrates addresses Euthyphro. Socrates, By the powers, Euthyphro, how little does the common herd know of the nature of right and truth. A man must be an extraordinary man and have made great strides in wisdom before he can have seen his way to this. And Euthyphro, indeed, Socrates, he must have made great strides. Socrates says, I suppose that the man your father murdered was one of your relatives. If he had been a stranger, you would have never thought of prosecuting him. And then Euthyphro says, well, I'm amused, Socrates, that you're making a distinction between one who is a relation and one who is not a relation. For surely the pollution is the same in either case. If you knowingly associate with a murderer when you ought to clear yourself by proceeding against him, the real question is whether the murdered man has been justly slain. So Socrates thinks that the real question is not whether the murdered man has been justly slain. We immediately doubt the chances of success by how condescendingly Euthyphro responds. I am amused, Socrates. And surely the gods in the audience suspect already that he is guilty of arrogance and hubris. The case against his father is fairly weak according to the standards of ancient justice. A field laborer quarreled with and killed a domestic servant, and his father bound him hand and foot in chains and threw him in a ditch while he sent for a diviner to tell him what to do. And while waiting, the guy in the ditch died of cold and hunger and chains, as Euthyphro puts it. Socrates does not argue the guilt of the father. That the father bears guilt is understood and unquestioned. But what about the decision of the loving son? We must all make this difficult decisions in life, whether we should divorce an unfaithful spouse, whether we should help out a wayward grown son one more time, and whether to place an aging parent in a nursing home or not. In these decisions, motives matter. Equally virtuous people can make different decisions in very similar circumstances. The opposing decisions could be both moral decisions. What matters most when we make these difficult and often life-changing decisions is how we make these decisions, whether our motives are pure, whether we use proper moral criteria. What decision we make is critically important, of course, but this is a private matter between ourselves and Jesus, and others should resist the temptation to judge us. So what's going on here? The ancient world is not our modern world in more ancient times. In ancient Athens, judicial cases were heard in front of juries of 500 Athenians. There were no rules of evidence. These cases were public debates at fixed times. The mob decides. His father could be exiled or executed. There was no prison sentences. There were no prisons. What would happen to his mother, to his siblings, to their servants? What is absolutely certain is we do not know everything. The Son is only telling us what he chooses to tell us. The Son is impetuous, that we know. We can surmise that his father is impetuous. He's probably guilty of the same faults he finds in his father. What sort of quarrels has he been having with his father? Were there hurts for which he seeks revenge? So Socrates dangles the bait. Good heavens, Euthyphro, and you have such a precise knowledge of piety and impiety, and of divine things in general, that supposing the circumstances to be as you state, you are not afraid that you too may be doing an impious thing and bringing an action against your father. And Euthyphro responds, the best of Euthyphro, and that which distinguishes him, Socrates, from other men, is his exact knowledge of all these matters. What should I be good for without that? And the fish bobs a line, and Socrates then tries to set the hook. So he asks his friend Euthyphro, exactly what is piety and what is impiety? The first definition that Euthyphro offers is piety by example, since he knows that what he's doing is pious. It serves as a good example of piety, so why bother with definitions? Besides, we all know that Zeus himself bound up his father Cronos because he wickedly devoured his sons and punished others in his family too. So if Zeus can be impious, why not I? So Socrates succeeds in getting Euthyphro to admit that the gods in Mount Olympus fought and cheated with each other like men who are immortal, and that examples of piety do not tell us what makes all things to be pious. For an example of the immortal Greek gods behaving badly, all ancient Greeks would have heard the story of the War of Troy recited dozens of times at religious festivals, and that we hear about in the Iliad and the Odyssey. First, Zeus allowed Paris, Prince of Troy, to select his choice for the most beautiful goddess, and he chose Aphrodite when she promised him the hand of the most beautiful women of the world, Helen, who was, unfortunately, the wife of the Achaean king Menelaus. But that didn't bother them. The goddess Aphrodite then put into motion the actions that resulted in the Trojan War by helping Paris kidnap Helen. And he brought her to Troy to be his bride, and thus condemned to death many Greeks and Trojans, and caused the sacking of his city Troy. And all of this for what? Just for, passing passionate pleasures for just one man, Paris. Returning to the dialogue, when he's pressed for a definition rather than examples by Socrates, all Euthyphro can answer is that piety is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. He's pressed further, and Euthyphro said that he believes that all the gods would agree that murderers should be punished. Socrates reminds him that his father's victim was himself a murderer in chains awaiting judgment, but that the crime was that he was not treated humanely, and he asks him, how can he be so sure that all the gods would be unanimous in their praise of his prosecution? Right about now, Euthyphro is probably asking himself, what sort of friend is this Socrates? I'm looking for agreement and affirmation, and all I get is arguments? Euthyphro complains. Our arguments, wherever they stand, seem to turn around and walk away. So, like many, Socrates frustrates him. This dialogue is significant because Socrates would later be condemned to death and be forced to drink the deadly hemlock for impiety towards the gods and for misleading the youth of Athens. Socrates then notes that if they were going to work that definition, they could say that something would be pious if all the gods saw it as pious, and something would be impious if all the gods thought that, but that most of the life in the middle would be muddled, which leads to an important question. Do the gods love that which is holy, or is things holy because they are loved by the gods? You might think this is a valid question for the ancient Greeks, but it is not an issue for Christians. Don't we believe that God is love? But as the dialogue demonstrates, whether we seek to employ God to serve our own selfish egos and interests is as much of a moral problem today as it ever was. So what is Christianity? That we should love God with all of our heart and with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and with all of our strengths? And we should love our neighbors as ourselves, which is a definition of piety that dwarfs Euthyphro's lame attempts. And when we keep this in mind, when we gaze on the face of Jesus, never turning away, this selfless love is the lens through which we should see life. When we turn away from this twofold love, our personal morality is nothing more than an alternative truth of deception. And going back to the dialogue, there's more back and forth, and Euthyphro tries another definition. Piety or holiness could be the justice that attends to the gods, rather than the part of justice that attends to men. And Socrates asks, that is like saying horsemanship is tending to horses, and that being a huntsman is tending to his hunting dogs, and that being an ox herd is tending to the oxen. Likewise, is holiness the art of attending to the gods? So life is like us bargaining with God, saying, God, let's make a deal. I'll be good, you make my life easy. However, leading a godly life does not guarantee that life will be fair, nor does it guarantee that we will not suffer needlessly. If you lead a godly life, sometimes you will be happy, sometimes not. So beware, if you fancy yourself a devout Christian, you may think you are trying to please God. But how do you know that you are really striving to please the person in the pew next to you? So after more back and forth, Socrates asks Euthyphro, does your piety or holiness, your attending to the gods, benefit or improve the gods? Do your holy acts make any of the gods better? Of the many and fair actions of the gods, which is the chief and principal one? Euthyphro says to Socrates, I have told you already, Socrates, that to learn all these things accurately is very tiresome. Let me simply say that piety is learning how to please the gods in word and deed by prayers and sacrifices. Tiresome indeed it is to learn how to lead a godly life. Why do we need to learn such things? Isn't it good enough just to get a good job, mow the lawn, and pay our taxes? Why not just let the preachers learn such tiresome things? They can preach to us, and we can ignore what we think is too hard from what they say. But if God gave us the gift of consciousness, gave us the ability to worship God, God also gave us the ability to ponder questions of right and wrong, gave us the ability to love our God and our neighbor. Who are we to deny these precious gifts and choose to live like selfish beasts? Socrates then asks Euthyphro many unsettling questions. Is piety the science of asking and giving? Is piety the right way of asking of them what we want? And crassly, is piety an art which gods and men have of doing business with one another? Socrates has done his best. He gives up, so he ends the dialogue. For if you had certainly known the nature of piety and impiety, I am confident you would never, on behalf of a serf, have charged your aged father with murder. You would not have run such a risk of doing wrong in the sight of the gods, and you would have had too much respect for the opinions of men. So, he answers the question, how do you know? How do you know what is right and wrong? Do you start with what you think is right and wrong and shape your morality around that? Or is there an independent right and wrong out there that you should measure yourself against? Do you start with your interpretation of this right and this wrong and shape your morality around that? How do you know your interpretation is an honest self-judgment or merely self-justification? How do you know? Which is how I ended my blog. But that was then, and now is now, and after pondering this further, maybe Euthyphro was morally correct. Not only that, maybe this was a trap set by Plato. Maybe he really agrees with me. Maybe he described an extreme situation to test whether we have passed the Kantian test, which is that we should act in a morally decisive manner when necessary, regardless of the consequences. And after reading several modern slave autobiographies, this kind of swayed my opinion of Euthyphro. Socrates was influenced, and Plato also, by the cultural norms of his times. And the ancient Greeks had a rather low view of slaves and their worth and their basic humanity. This can be seen by the discussion by Aristotle. This slide is from our video on slavery in the ancient world. Aristotle, in his Politics, asserts this: the slave is a piece of property which is animate. That slaves born into slavery are by nature slaves, and natural slaves are similar in nature to tame animals. He doesn't have an opinion of slaves or women or children. The slave has no deliberate faculty at all. The woman has, but it is without authority, and the child has, but it is immature. This refusal to view slaves not as real people, but as basically talking livestock with little moral development or intellectual capability, is also seen in the slave autobiographies that were published around the time of the Civil War. For instance, Booker T. Washington, in his slave autobiography, he states that white masters regard their slaves merely as talking livestock. Booker said that when his mother was purchased by his master, she was noticed just as much as a newly purchased horse or cow would be noticed. And W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction tells us this: in the upper states, as much attention is paid to the breeding and growth of Negroes as that of horses and mules, and that planters command their slave girls, married and unmarried, to have children, and many of them are sold off if they don't have children. Likewise, Frederick Douglass, the famous civil rights leader during the Civil War times, it is a common custom in Maryland to part children from their mothers at an early age. These slave owners were as quick to separate slave children from their parents as people today give away puppies from the pet dog's litter. So, going back to the Euthyphro, tying a slave or a servant hand and foot, throwing him in a ditch, then spending a day or two to consult with the diviner on what you should do with the troublesome slave, leaving a slave to die from cold and hunger, this is just sheer callousness. This is cruelty. This is murder. And Euthyphro's father was a murderer, pure and simple. Euthyphro's father cared nothing for the welfare of his slave, and we might add to that list also possibly Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And as is observed in many of the slave autobiographies, slavery damages the soul of the slave owner. Why, indeed, are we exhorted to love all of our neighbors as ourselves, no exceptions? Well, because it is impossible for us to split humanity in two. To this a portion of humanity that we will love, and that portion of humanity whom we will either hate or disregard. Cruelty towards one corrupts our love for all. So, when pondering this dialogue of Euthyphro, we must remember that slavery, both in the ancient world and the antebellum Deep South, was a cruel institution. Although there were a few kind masters, slavery as an institution was cruel and uncaring wherever it existed. So, you might ask, what happened to the son of the Capitol rioter? Well, People magazine article says this: Jackson says he has not spoken to his father since his arrest, but I wish I could, he told the reporter. I would say I'm sorry, because I don't feel like I put him in this situation, but I still feel a little guilty. But asked by the reporter if he'd do it again, he said, yes, I would do it again. And a Politico article in March 2021 stated that the judge in the case denied bond for the rioting father, concerned that he would commit further violence based on his prior statements. His family testified that they felt totally safe with their father. They thought he got caught up in the Fox Newsiness of the situation, but perhaps the judge was skeptical that his family would be safe if their father were released because, well, how often do a father's children feel compelled to testify that they really would feel safe if their father was released? Perhaps this was also an issue with Euthyphro. Quite likely this was an actual event. If his father could be so cruel to his slave, well, the next question then is, was he guilty of abusing his son, and possibly his mother also? But men had much greater latitude in the ancient world to punish their slaves, their wives, and their children as they saw fit. So, like all Socratic dialogues in Plato, the only sure statement possible is, nothing certain, who knows? But let's ponder the two situations a bit further. When we're exhorted to love our neighbor, when we're exhorted to honor our parents, many Christians think that this means we should not do anything that will make our loved ones angry. But loving our neighbor and respecting our parents doesn't really mean that. What it really means is that we should act in their best interest, that we should be positive influences in their lives. Perhaps the questions Jackson and his mother could ask themselves when they pondered whether to turn in their father for insurrection is this: could this experience lead their father to become a better person? And if they did nothing, would this prevent their father from becoming a better person as a result of this experience? The same two questions could be asked by Socrates and Euthyphro, though their situation may be a bit murkier and less certain. And we want to discuss the sources that we used in this video. Euthyphro is one of the shorter Platonic dialogues. This translation by Benjamin Jowett is very readable. And there is also some YouTube videos and a LibriVox video that narrate the entire dialogue, which only takes about a half an hour. Please click on the link below for our blog on Euthyphro in the description. And please click on the links for interesting videos on Socrates and other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.